Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm already seeing 48 people in the room. That's fantastic. Welcome. I'd like to invite you all to add your name and where you're joining us from into the chat box. If you don't mind making sure that you've got the chat selected to everyone, just so we can all see where you're joining us from. I'm so excited to have you all here today. I just want to make sure that everybody can send. There we go. We should be able to all send now. I'm sorry that that wasn't updated right away. Thank you, Paul. You've confirmed that this is working now. Perfect. Welcome, everybody. It's so great to see you. Oh, wow. We've got some people who are worldwide. Someone's joining from the Philippines. This is fantastic. Across Canada, Waterloo, Sudbury, Victoria, Wichita, Kansas. Oh, my goodness. This is fantastic. I'm so glad to see you all here. And I am so glad to see some people who I know who have worked with in customer care. So it's great to see you all joining us today. Excellent. I'm just going to wait another minute or two just for a few more people to jump in. We're already closing in on 200 participants. Not to put any pressure on you, Jesse, just saying. But it's wonderful to see where everyone's joining from. Alberta, Montreal, Lanark County, Ontario. I'm familiar. Wonderful. Oh, this is so great. It's so wonderful to see everyone. St. Thomas. Oh, there's a few people from St. Thomas. Fantastic. Colorado. Oh, this is great. Thank you all for joining us. Fantastic. Well, my name is Elise. I am a member of the Keela Customer Care Team, and I am joining today from Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Let's jump in. So first of all, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here with us today. Like I said, my name is Elise. I am a customer support specialist here at Keela. I am also a former Keela user from a nonprofit, so I have been right where you are fundraising. We also have my incredible colleague Chelsea here helping us out today on the tech side of things. She's our digital designer. You might see her in the chat box or answering some of your tech questions, so feel free to say hello to Chelsea. I want to acknowledge that Keela's head office is located in Vancouver, which is on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the coastal Salish people, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, and give thanks for their generosity and hospitality on these lands and waters. I invite all of you to take a moment to acknowledge the lands and waters from which you are joining us today. If you're new to Keela, welcome. Keela is a fundraiser CRM, meaning that it is designed with the unique needs of fundraisers in mind and aims to unify fundraising, communications, and donor management into a singular source of truth. Before I hand it off to Jesse, I would like to welcome Emily Jensen from Imagine Canada and Grant Connect. Emily is the Manager of Strategic Advocacy and is going to say a few words about Imagine Canada and Grant Connect for us today. Emily, over to you.
Thank you so much. Hi, my name's Emily Jensen, and I'm Imagine Canada's Manager of Strategic Advocacy on the Public Policy team. And I'm also the backbone staff person for the Funding Reform Working Group. Today's session focuses on how to get federal funding, but we all know that there is some room for improvement in terms of how the government funds our sector. So the Funding Reform Working Group is an advocacy coalition with organizations across the country, and we have a mission to make federal funding for the nonprofit sector more effective and equitable for nonprofits, the communities they serve, and also their staff. If you're interested in learning more or getting involved in some collective advocacy on this issue, please reach out to me by email and I'll put that in the chat. And that's all for me. I just wanted to give a little plug for that group. And otherwise, I'm really excited to learn from Jesse during today's session. And back to you, Elise.
Thank you so much, Emily. So great to hear from the folks at Imagine Canada and Grant Connect. I have utilized Grant Connect and Imagine Canada as a fundraiser, and I probably would have been lost without your services. So know that you are doing really important work in their community. Anyway, back to the topic at hand. I am very excited to welcome our expert presenter for today, Jesse Clarke. Jesse is a government funding expert on a mission to transform Canada's charities and nonprofit relationships with government. Jessie brings over 20 years of experience in government and nonprofit leadership, including senior roles leading government relations and government funding strategies for several Canadian organizations. She spent the first 10 years of her career as a federal civil servant before joining the nonprofit sector in 2010. Jessie has raised more than $100 million in government grants during her career, working for organizations including Right to Play, Pathways to Education, and Save the Children. She founded J.N. Clarke Consulting in February 2021. And since founding the firm, J.N. Clarke Consulting has grown to a team of 4+ associates and has provided transformative government relations services to more than 40 different organizations across Canada's charity and nonprofit sectors. J.N. Clarke Consulting offers strategy and retainer support in government relations to nonprofits across Canada, as well as grant writing to selective clients. J.N. Clarke Consulting is a proud feminist and LGBTQ plus owned firm with a strong commitment to anti-racism, decolonization, and progressive values. We are absolutely thrilled to have you join us today, Jessie. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, Elise. Thanks for the lovely introduction. And I'm really excited to be here. I love talking about how government works and government grants, and everything policy and funding nerd related, and that's why I do what I do. So thanks to everyone for joining. I'll just quickly kind of give you a bit of an overview. So I've already had the introduction, so we can skip right through that part and get into the content. But I just wanted to mention as well that in addition to the land acknowledgement, I like to start off, especially when I'm doing online presentations with people from across Canada and globally as well, with drawing people's attention to truth and reconciliation calls to action. There was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission report released with 94 calls to action several years ago now. I think almost 9 years ago now. There at this point, very few of those calls to action have actually been fulfilled. There is a great resource available from the Yellowhead Institute, and it's linked there in the presentation. They have been producing an annual report on accountability for the TRC implementation. And I really encourage everyone to take a look at that report and even to take the next step of sharing it with your MP and asking for what have they been doing to ensure that those calls to action are actually being responded to and fulfilled. Because I think it's just important for us, in addition to, land acknowledgement and other gestures of reconciliation, to also think about how we can inform ourselves and hold our government to account for implementing the calls that came from this commission. So link is there, and feel free to take a look. And I will note that they actually unfortunately stopped updating the report this year after 5 years because there was so little progress that they didn't think it was worth updating. However, they still have a lot of great resources, and the 2023 report still has a lot of great information. So just quickly refer you to that. Then on to what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to cover kind of three main topics. One is where to find federal government funding, including, some places that kind of go a little bit beyond the usual suspects, I think, of where we're used to finding funding, some of the less obvious places to find it. A bit on when and how to apply, how to make that decision. Should you go for it? Are you eligible? And then if you do go for it, how to make sure you have a winning proposal. And then finally, I want to talk a bit at the end as well about how you can build up your overall organizational reputation and brand with government, because in my mind, you want to be doing all of these things at the same time. You don't want to just be looking for government funding or applying for government funding. You also want at all times to be building up your reputation with government and building a long-term relationship. Because then ideally you'll be invited to apply. They'll already know you when you're submitting an application, and your whole chance of getting new funding and finding funding will be much elevated. So I'm going to go through those three areas today, and leave a bit of time for questions at the end as well. So first of all, I think we all know that government funding is significant, I think, to the sector in Canada. This is the 2021 CRA data from the Charities Directorate that showed that in that year, based on T3010 reporting, The total charitable revenue in Canada was $309 billion. And of that, 229 billion of that came from government sources. And that's all different levels of government. So it's not certainly not all federal funding. A large portion of that's also provincial funding. And then there's also even, some municipal funding, although it tends to be a bit smaller. But it's certainly a significant force to be reckoned with within the sector, and something that I think every organization should have on its radar. We have a very close working relationship with government in many organizations and charities and nonprofits across Canada, and I think there's a lot of ways that can be really mutually beneficial for both us and the government that I'm going to talk about today as well. So that's just a bit of context. If you're looking for government funding, there's a few different places that I would send you. I'm going to walk you through a couple of them right now. I would say, one of the things I would say about government websites, and this may not come as a surprise to anybody here, um, they're really, they're trying and they're doing a lot of great work and trying to make themselves, more digitally accessible, putting more information out there. But it's still pretty hard to find things that you're looking for on those websites, partly because there's so much information, and it's not always clear where to look. So I like to give a bit of a suggestion to people. First of all, there is a kind of grant finding resource website, and that's the first one I've linked to there, this grants and funding from the Government of Canada. I will say the links are not all up to date on it, so a bit of a caveat there. But it does let you go into that website and then check what subject matter area you're looking for, and then it should then spit out a list to you of departments and also open funding opportunities. So, great. If it happens, if it's working well, that's fantastic. I know it's had a few glitches. That being said, though, I think that there's a lot more you can do if you're really trying to put together a real government funding strategy, a meaningful strategy for your organization. And the first place I would direct you is to this very official sounding proactive disclosure database, but really it's just the federal government grants database. The link again is there, and within that database, you can actually search for basically any amount, any grants that over $25,000 that the federal government has given for the last 10 plus years. So it's a massive database, as you might expect. But why I think that's really useful is sometimes when an organization is just starting out and thinking, well, I don't even know where to look. Like, there's so many different parts of the government, who would be interested in funding the kind of work that I do. That can be a really good place to start because you can look for, you can search by, for example, the name of the recipient. So you can see, first of all, if your own organization, hopefully if your own organization received government funding in the past, but there can be sometimes some corporate memory gaps. But you can also look for other organizations that do similar work to you and see if they've received government funding, and if so, from where and when. And it's a great place to actually try and just get a bit of that information, or say you've been talking to a contact and they've said, oh, you should really look into this department. Well, you can look and see what actually is the kind of funding this department's been giving out. And although it is a bit of an intimidating database because it's all of the funding, it has lots of great search filters, and just even spending an hour or so on there can really give you a lot of great insights into who the government funds, when and where, and how much. So that's one place I really recommend that people go look. Um, Another place that you can look is actually just to go into the individual department websites. A lot of the individual government departments, if you Google federal government department name. In this case, it's Employment and Social Development Canada, which is certainly one of the departments that gives it the most funding, I would say, to nonprofits and charities. If you Google the department name and funding opportunities, then you'll usually be led to a page very much like this, where you can find any open funding opportunities, or even, you can look at ones that are recently closed, because that can also be great information. Maybe it's something that comes up once a year and you want to plan in advance. Often, as many of us know, when they open the windows for these opportunities, you might only have, 5 weeks, 6 weeks, sometimes even less to get ready. So it's good if you can plan in advance. And most departments have something like this. So it's another good place to find information. I I would say that it's not always available right off of the homepage of the department. It's not consistently available. So I would recommend just going into Google, as I suggested, and finding it that way, to avoid trying to navigate through an individual department's website, which I don't recommend necessarily. And then another place to look is actually to look in news releases. And again, this might seem intimidating, but again, with using the right search filters, spending an hour and a half, it's time really well spent. If you go through this database, and this link that I put here gives you all of the news releases, and communiques, backgrounders that the government has put out. And one thing about the federal government is that if they hand out money, they like to talk about it usually. They usually want to make sure that they've announced it, and try to kind of maximize whatever good PR and public impact they can get from handing out that funding. So often there's lots of different announcements for funding in and among these news releases and these communiques. So again, if you know kind of which department you're looking for, or give yourself a limited search window in terms of time, you'd be amazed at what you can find inside that search as well. So there's a few places to look that I think are really worth looking. I mean, of course, there are government websites. You will get government social media. I think that's another thing I would suggest. I used to tell people to go to Twitter, but I don't do that anymore. But I will say that even a lot of government departments actually have Instagram now as well, which is interesting. And if there's new opportunities being released that they really want to try and drive interest in, they're going to put them on their social media. So that's definitely a good place to look as well. A few other places. So as I mentioned, there is also a lot of provincial and municipal government funding, and I can't give you kind of a comprehensive list of where to look by province or by city, but that's how I recommend, again, just using province or city and funding for nonprofits. Be as specific as you can, and that should give you some useful results in terms of where to find funding. And then, of course, there's lots of different umbrella organizations like the wonderful Imagine Canada, where we are right now. They have great resources like Grant Connect, that also does include government funding in it. Several different provinces have, different provincial associations or networks for nonprofits. Maybe you're within kind of a particular sector that has its own sector association or industry association. Those can also be great sources of information. And one more thing that I didn't put on here specifically, but I do recommend, if you have, a good relationship with other organizations, and they're willing, that can be a great way also to get information. You can say, well, look, if you have had government funding in the past, where did you get it from, or who did you work with? Do you have any tips? And I think some people are, I think it varies. Sometimes in the sector, people can be sometimes a bit more, reluctant to share that, but definitely a lot of people are willing to share that information, at least in general, and to give you a bit of an idea of kind of where they've found funding, or even sometimes it's listed on organizations' annual reports. So those are just a few places, because I would sort of encourage you, and it's not that you have to look at these websites, weekly or anything like that, but just certainly to look at them maybe on an annual basis at very least, to make sure you're really leaving, no stone unturned. When people talk about government funding, it can really feel like a big monolith. And so I would really encourage you to use some of these tools and resources, um, to try and narrow down a little bit, okay, well, what actually is most relevant to my organization? So that's a bit on where to find government funding. Then I'm just going to talk right now about when you're deciding to apply, how to make that decision, and then some tips for developing some successful proposals as well. Which, as you know, especially when there's an open call for proposals, it's incredibly competitive. Um, Before I go into that, actually, I did want to say that as well. I think that there's basically there's two main ways that the federal government funds organizations. There are the open calls for proposals that I think many of us may be familiar with. Some sectors, there's annual calls. Some departments, and they'll issue these huge open calls and maybe receive, hundreds of applicants. But there are also other ways of getting funding from the government that can happen when you have that pre-existing relationship. and those can both be kind of like solicited. There's a whole, that's a very government jargon kind of term, but it's where they reach out to partners that they already know about, that they already have a reputation with, and invite them to apply for a specific opportunity. So that's one way. If you've already done the work of building your reputation and relationship with government, sometimes you can be invited to apply. Sometimes they'll be creating new funding streams that really are designed with a few different organizations in mind, because those organizations have been lobbying for increased funding for that particular sector. So, there's ways that you can be a bit more proactive and not just sort of be reacting to opportunities when they're posted. And certainly encourage you to look into those as well. But let's talk now about when we actually do see opportunities that are posted. And often, if you've been to look into one of those federal opportunities lately, they can be long websites. They can have lots of like links embedded in them to different policies. The first question that I think is really, really important for any organization, and it should be straightforward, but it's not always. So I think you really need to dig into eligibility requirements, and before you spend any time working on an application or pulling together documents, confirm that you actually are eligible to apply. Sometimes eligibility is restricted to a certain type of organization, whether it can be nonprofits or charities. Sometimes it could be, for example, to an Indigenous-led organization or an organization in a certain geographic area. So I think certainly confirm that your organization fits that criteria. Often, of course, it's very much tied to a specific sector or theme. And there's very, very commonly some kind of policy or programming framework that the government links to within their RFP to say, we're giving it this funding because we're trying to fulfill the goals or objectives of this framework. So make sure you refer to that framework and make sure that what you're doing, aligns somewhat with what they're looking for in terms of what you're proposing. Because if it's not a good fit, you're gonna spend a lot of time trying to fit something that doesn't make sense, and then not actually be successful with your application. I mentioned geography already, but certainly some opportunities are for specific geographies, or they're for organizations that are serving particular clientele, particular target populations. So really important to take a look at that as part of eligibility. Legal or financial requirements. And I highlight this as well because often you might know that you're eligible to apply, but you also have to give them a certain amount of documentation to prove that, right? And so there's usually a checklist of, for example, your board composition or some of your bylaws that you might need to share, annual reports, financial reports, et cetera, that you have to make sure you have all of those ready. So not only is it confirming that yes, we're eligible, but yes, we can prove that we're eligible as well, because it's not the kind of thing, I've had this experience with organizations, with clients before too, where people are saying, well, maybe we can send it in after. No, you can't send it in after. Generally speaking, that's just not something, unless they specifically say that you can send things in later. 95% of the time, you have to have everything ready for the date that the application is due, or even ideally a few days before, especially if you're applying online. And again, sometimes they're looking for organizations that have a particular kind of experience or level of experience, or can demonstrate that through showing they have a program evaluation that was completed on their work. Or they've had, ironically, you can get in that catch-22. Well, they'll say, well, we only want organizations who've already shown they can, use government funding effectively sometimes, which can be a bit of a frustrating catch-22, but can be the case for certain opportunities. So just make sure that you've really done your homework and you're confident that you are eligible to apply and you can show that eligibility before you move forward with using all of our precious and limited organizational resources. Then the next thing that I think not everyone thinks about is also, should you apply? Because not just because you're eligible, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to be a great use of, again, your limited time and energy as an organization. So, I think one of the things to consider is, if you are able to get that information, how competitive is this opportunity? What is your likelihood of success? Have you been funded by them before, or have you had a conversation with someone that suggests that it's worth applying? Is it really aligned well with your own priorities? So I think that's something that you should always be considering. Are there any risks that you might have from applying? And that's, it sounds like a bit of a strange question, but I think, it's worth considering. What if you apply, get the funding, and then all of a sudden you realize you actually can't deliver this program the way that you said you could? I mean, it does happen. Life happens. Government funders are people too, and you can explain. But if that's the kind of thing that you think is likely to happen, that can create a real reputational risk. There's also challenges that I think we as a sector contend with a lot, where you've dug deep and done the work for a proposal, and you've consulted your community, and you've raised their expectations, and then you don't get funded, and that's also kind of a bit of a risk where it can have negative impacts, at least on some of your relationships. So, those are just things to keep in mind. I don't think any of this necessarily should deter you, but I think what I really mean here is you want to make sure you're picking the best opportunities, that are most aligned to your priorities as an organization. Financial impact, I think that's also really important to consider. And I talked to so many different organizations who say, we got this funding and we're really excited, but it actually only covers about 20% of what it costs us to deliver this program, right? And the overhead's limited, or we didn't realize that we could build in staff time into this grant, and as a result, we didn't really recover enough costs from it. So those are also important things to think about. What are the guidelines? How much can you cover in terms of costs? And where does it kind of fit in your broader portfolio of grants as an organization? Is this something that's going to supplement and provide needed funding, or is it actually going to become harder to implement because you don't necessarily have the resources you need to fully implement it from the grant? Um, Strategic alignment, I've spoken to a little bit already, I think, but really, it's very tempting, and I think we've all been there, or many of us in nonprofits have been there, when there's a shiny new opportunity. So let's create a shiny new program that will meet those parameters, right? Um, and sometimes that can be a really great growth opportunity for an organization, but sometimes it can just send you in a direction that doesn't make a lot of sense because you're chasing funding. And again, I think we've all been there sometimes. And I think again, that's an organizational decision. Is this in line with our strategy? Is this something we really want to be moving forward into? Um, and then finally, organizational capacity to apply. Do you have the people you need and the skills you need to do this application? What are the trade-offs? Are you trying to do an application at the same time that you're also trying to finish 3 or 4 other reports? Do you actually have the staff capacity, or the ability to fill in any gaps in that capacity if needed? And those are important things to consider as well. So those are some of the things I like people to really think about. And I would add, a couple of other things to this sort of whole, eligibility and should you apply kind of area of discussion. One of which is you can always, almost always, reach out to the funder. There's very often there's an email address listed in the RFP. Or maybe there's an FAQ posted on the website that you can send questions into that FAQ, and then they'll post the responses. So if you're wondering, are we really eligible? Should we apply? Um, I would definitely encourage you to reach out to the funder, with any of the contact information you have, either directly related to that, or if you have other contacts within that department, who can perhaps refer you to the right people, and ask those questions. There's no harm in asking those questions. In fact, if anything, there's a benefit in doing that because you'll already be making a connection with the funder. They'll see that you're really taking this seriously and considering and thinking this through. So that's always a good idea, in my opinion, if you have time and if there's available contact information, just to reach out to the funder and say, well, is this something that you think would work well for us? Um, and then the other thing is, if for some reason you think you're not eligible or you don't meet all these criteria, that's sometimes a good time to think about applying, in coalition with somebody else, right? And the government can really welcome those kinds of creative partnerships that we can put together in the sector. Maybe you have really great technical expertise or really strong, community relationships in this one community geographically that you can bring to the table for someone else who has kind of a more robust, financial management system that they've used to manage a lot of government grants. And that's a good way to kind of start building up your reputation with government for the first time. So something else to consider, partnerships and how can they really help you be successful. So that's kind of a bit on the whole, should you apply? Can you apply? Are you eligible? And if you do apply, sort of thinking through some of the things you need to take into consideration as well. Um, so if you've decided that you are eligible, that you think you have a reasonable likelihood of success, and that you've weighed any of the risks, impact, etc. How do you need to move forward in order to create a successful proposal? And I'm giving you kind of my here, five top tips and recommendations. I mean, proposal writing, it's a profession. There's a lot of work. So this is a bit of a quick overview just for the purposes of the webinar. But I think, there's a lot in grant writing, and I think there's a lot of great resources out there, including from Imagine Canada, and others, in terms of how to actually write proposals and more detailed workshops around that kind of thing as well. And so certainly keep in mind those opportunities. Also, I would say too, like a lot of government funders now, it's not uncommon for them to hold a webinar when they're launching a new funding window. And if you can go to that webinar, definitely do that. But turning into how to craft a winning proposal. So as I mentioned before, you want to make sure you read through all of the documents they provide really carefully. So do your homework, read through the RFP, read through the eligibility requirements, and very often they're going to link to program frameworks or policy documents. And I had a high school teacher who used to tell us when writing essays, tell them what you're going to say it, and then tell them what you said. And I think that's a really good rule for proposals. And in this case, I would go even further and say, make sure that you're not making them guess. You're being crystal clear that what you're doing matches up perfectly with their goals and objectives. And even if you think it's really obvious, to you, think about how an external reader might be reading it. It might not be obvious to them. And make sure that you're really clear and explicit about how what you're proposing lines up with what they're trying to achieve. So that's what I would say around doing your homework. Analyzing your organization's qualifications. I think that, we talked about a little bit about that in terms of eligibility, but I think also, you know, it's similar almost to applying for a job sometimes, where they'll say, well, these are some of the attributes we're looking for in organizations, or these are the factors we're going to be evaluating. And make sure that you've really demonstrated clearly how you have all of those necessary qualifications or requirements, or how your project really meets those requirements specifically. So I think the more time you spend thinking about that at the beginning, the better quality your proposal will be in the end. And even if you spend some time kind of listing through the requirements and then writing out beside that an answer and examples for how you meet those requirements, that's also time that's very well spent. And that closely relates to the next point, which is creating work plan. Because often when you're doing a proposal, you're going to need to call in resources from different parts of your organization. You don't want to find out at the last minute that someone's gone on vacation and you can't find the financial report, or whatever it might be. I think so make sure you know the exact deadline. Often there's a time as well, and make sure you know the time zone. These are all things that seem basic, but there are things I've seen cause problems many times for organizations. Also, if you have to access an online portal, which is quite common these days, make sure you're set up well in advance of the due date. They often recommend having a couple of business days in advance of the due date to upload, just in case they're having any problems on their end with their system. And just make sure that you're really well prepared, and have any of the external documents you're going to need to upload. This is the kind of thing people run into all the time. It's like you need to have a letter of support from a partner or a community member, or maybe you need to have, if it's an infrastructure project, you need to have some kind of environmental analysis that's been done on this property previously, for example. And if you don't have that at the time of submission, and you've gone to all this work of developing a proposal, you can just get disqualified right after you submit, and that's a really frustrating situation that's best to avoid. So as much as you can kind of analyze everything you need and create that work plan in advance and figure out how you're going to get everything you need, it'll put you in a much better situation. You don't want to find out a week beforehand that, again, that you're not going to be able to meet all the requirements, unfortunately, because you're relying on something external. So a couple more points on this. I think that this is an important point that, again, sounds simple, but when you're designing a program, especially if this is a new program, I mean, I know government funding, it varies. Sometimes you're just asking for funding for something that's already underway, but you need to think really carefully about what are all the activities that we're going to need to do in order to achieve the objectives that we're saying we're going to meet. And have we thought of everything? And then go back and think again. And I say this because then you want to make sure that you've also gone through with all those activities and costed out how much it's going to cost. Because this is where you can really get into problems when you're inadvertently underfund yourself because you've said that you're going to do all of these things, but you forgot to factor in the training cost or the transportation cost or the staff costs into the budget for a given proposal. And it can be hard because of course you don't want to sort of you want to be competitive financially. But I think more ultimately yes, it's important to be competitive with your bid, say that they're evaluating the financial bid as part of the application. But you want to make sure you've also given yourself enough money to do what you said you're going to do. I think other things that can be really helpful to think about with that kind of discussion as well is there other guidelines around cost per stakeholder, beneficiary, client? Do you need to be able to show them that it costs you a certain amount to deliver per person in the program, for example? Is that, and is that something you've done the work on then? That can be a really important area to consider when you're designing your budget. And also, is this like a $30 million funding envelope? And there's, probably they're going to give what, maybe 10, 15 grants. Well, then don't apply for $20 million, right? Because you're going to be way, way out of whack for how much they're actually going to be allocating to each organization. So try and keep that in mind as well. What's the overall funding envelope? Once you've done all of that work, then review, right? Do you make sure you're meeting all the requirements? You have everything you need, and definitely get someone to read it over if possible. Try and avoid typos, especially budget typos. I think can be a real nightmare for people. And as much as you can, be as ready as you possibly can be before you hit submit. So those are kind of my top 5 tips for crafting a winning proposal. Just to go back, do your homework. Make sure you really understand your own organization's qualifications, create a work plan, and make sure you have everybody on board that you need. Um, Design in a lot of detail your program activities and budget, and give it a really good review. And something else that I always encourage is once you've submitted, hopefully you'll get a response. Sometimes you don't get a response, so that's another situation. But if you get a response, and even if you're rejected, I would really encourage you to go back to the government funder and say, okay, thanks for letting us know, but can you give us any detailed feedback on why this wasn't accepted? And even better if you can get a phone call or a meeting with them for them to talk to you, because sometimes you can get a canned response and they'll say, well, we had too many proposals, not enough money. Well, that doesn't really get you anywhere in terms of understanding. But the more that you can learn from each of those opportunities, the better. And I would also say too that when you're applying for government funding, you might be applying in a window that's super competitive. There's hundreds of people applying, and you think, well, what are the chances of us getting this? Well, sometimes just putting yourself on their radar as someone who's serious about doing this work and wants government funding, that's also something you can accomplish through submitting a proposal sometimes. That's also really valuable. So I wouldn't say it's like the primary reason for doing a proposal. It's a lot of work. But sometimes even if you're not successful, you've shown them that you actually are doing this work, that you wrote a good quality proposal. And sometimes that means that they're going to come back to you and say, look, we couldn't fund you through this envelope, but we know that you're working in this particular geographical area. We're looking for partners. So, let's talk about future collaboration. So sometimes it can be worth it even if you're not successful. Okay, that is everything on proposals. And then the last area I just wanted to cover is how can you really build up your organization's reputation? Because I think sometimes there's a tendency within charities and nonprofits to think, well, I mean, it's the government funding is kind of like the weather, like sometimes it turns on, sometimes it turns off. We don't really know how we can influence it in any way. Sometimes, long-term funding gets cut off and it seems really inexplicable and can cause, huge stress and headaches for organizations. So I would really encourage people to be as proactive as possible. And I've mentioned that a little bit already in some of the things that I've mentioned earlier in terms of funding, looking for funding opportunities. But I really tell people, get ready and stay ready is the philosophy. Have a plan for government engagement and really proactively work to build your reputation with government. Don't just sort of let government funding opportunities happen or not happen to you. And there's a lot of ways that you can do this that don't necessarily take up a huge amount of resources, because I know, not every organization has someone who's working on government relations for sure. It's very often it's the side of a desk kind of thing. So I just have a few tips here that I'm going to give you. And again, there's more. If you have questions, we'll get into that shortly. Something that I could talk about for a long time, but I would just want to give you kind of a bit of an overview of the basics. So if you're trying to build your brand with government, number one, when I say understand the basics, what do I mean? I mean that you should make sure you know what is the level of government that funds the kind of work you're interested in. Make sure you're not asking, a provincial government for something that's actually federal funding or vice versa, right? That can be an easy mistake to make, but it's embarrassing and can kind of be a waste of everybody's time if you're going into a meeting with, an MPP and you're asking about a federal program. So make sure you understand kind of who does what, and then really also try as best you can to understand, which departments are more relevant to your work. You can look for, federal mandate letters, and some provinces also publish mandate letters, not all. So you can see what is the actual role of that particular ministry and minister. That can also be a great way to kind of open up, try and get a local politician on board to help you navigate and say, look, we live in your riding, or our organization's in your riding, and we're new to government. Can you give us some pointers as to who we should talk to and which departments? And people often, in my experience in government, they love to help, especially if they aren't actually having to give you money right at that moment, right? But they love to help with information and helping you find things. Number two, everything, everywhere, everyone. Um, what I mean by this is that government funding is really an all hands on board kind of exercise. And organizations that are successful, in my experience, really see it that way, and they don't just sort of, hive it off into one small corner of the organization, but they recognize that there are assets and resources that you can leverage for government funding throughout your organization. So, and again, this is especially useful when you're a small organization, you don't have that many resources. There may be some fundraising documents that can be repurposed to use when you're introducing yourself to government for the first time. Maybe you're having a webinar, or you send out a newsletter and you can add government contacts to that, or, local politicians. Maybe you have board members who have a connection to a government official, and they're willing to open the door to have a meeting, set up a meeting for you. Basically, the idea that just don't leave any stones unturned internally as well, because you may miss out on some great assets, some great relationships that are already there. And you may miss out on some things you could reuse and repurpose very easily for a government audience as well. Number three, collaborate and participate. I think this is government really likes to see organizations collaborating. Certainly when it comes to advocacy, which is something that Imagine Canada colleagues can speak to. But I think even when you're applying for opportunities as well, if you show that you can work well with others, government likes to see that. Also, frankly, when you're working with other organizations and engaging in sector networks and sector meetings, it's a great way to get access to way more information than you could ever get in your own. You can share information with other colleagues from other organizations who may have recently spoken to a government official. Sometimes sector organizations will host events that you can go to that will give you access to people you wouldn't otherwise have access to on your own necessarily. And I think also if you can get out there and really participate and be visible, by showing yourself to be kind of a constructive member of civil society, that's something that can really reflect back well in the organization more broadly, especially if that reaches government, or it's involved with government specifically. And I would say, like, for example, there's a lot of consultations that governments have that they welcome and invite public participation. And if it's something that really makes a lot of sense and you have a lot to say about it, that could be a great opportunity, for example. So, and then evidence, policy, and perspective. I like to talk a lot about how a government relationship ideally is a win-win relationship where you're creating, success on both sides. And obviously, I think we all, a lot of us we know what nonprofits and charities usually want from government. And yeah, it's usually money most of the time. But what does the government need from us? And I think that can be a really interesting question to ask yourself as an organization, to ask government officials. there's a lot of things that nonprofits and charities bring to the table. One is evidence of programs that actually work. Do you have a report or an evaluation that shows how impactful your work was? It might be a little bit easier for you to show that kind of direct impact than it is for government that has to get, a massive evaluation, window approved every few years. So you can often have quicker access to information and more tangible that you can share with them. And then this is where I think engaging in policy, from a technical perspective, can be really valuable. If you show that you have something to say on these issues, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're advocating or protesting in the streets per se, but you're showing that, no, look, this is an issue that's important to us in our community, and we can share, our evidence and our perspective. That can be really meaningful. And I find too, government officials very often, they're really keen to know. Sometimes it's like, what are Canadians more generally thinking about something? Thinking about X or Y or Z issue, or what is you have better access often to local communities, the communities that you work with, than many federal bureaucrats do, and they're really keen to hear directly from your perspective on what are the topics of biggest concern to your communities, so they can pass that on to their senior management and onto political level as well. And then finally, I would say that you want to build reputation and build relationships. You sometimes will find allies and champions in the most unexpected places. If you have the chance to have, if you have a good working relationship with somebody, maybe they'll get moved to another department, which is frustrating and happens in government. But maybe that department also will have some valuable resources or insights or funding that you can then access. So, as much as I think everyone who's a fundraiser, really knows a lot about this whole idea of relationship management. I mean, here we've got Keela here. I've actually used some organizations I work for, I've used CRM systems to also include government relationships, because it can be a great way to kind of say, well, have I actually checked in with that person in the last 6 months and given them an update on how the program's going? That can be really, really worthwhile. Um, some of the things I talk about when I'm doing kind of some of the trainings and workshops that I've done or with clients, you know, think about the people on the other side of this relationship in government. They really want to feel a meaningful connection to the work that they're funding, right? Most of the people who do that, who do government work, they have some sense of public service and some sense of wanting to, be part of delivering programs that are meaningful. And so, can you help them see how the work that you're doing with their funding is meaningful and impactful? Um, or how it could potentially be. I think that can be really valuable as well. Because we often, I mean, yes, government tends to be a more technical funder, more, they tend to sort of have a bit more expectation around formality, but there are actually still people who are on the other end of this and who are making decisions. And having that kind of relationship with people and understanding where they're coming from can really go a long way in terms of building up a strong reputation with government as well. So those were kind of the main things that I wanted to cover today. I would definitely encourage everyone to follow me on LinkedIn or feel free to reach out by email. And I give free webinars, usually at least quarterly, if not more often as well. So you're welcome to subscribe, and you can find out more about those free webinars on different topics. But that's what I've got in terms of all of my secrets for government funding success, and I'll wrap it up. So thanks, everyone.
Jesse, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. I learned so much during the session, and I bet lots of our participants did too. We have a number of questions. So let's see how many we can get through. Callistus is, and I do apologize if I mispronounce anyone's name while I'm going through this. Callistus asks, does Government of Canada fund other NGOs outside of Canada, such as those in Africa or beyond?
So I would say kind of not really. I mean, it's a really good question. It does happen occasionally, but it's usually all going to be through a Canadian organization first. So they're going to fund the Canadian organization. The Canadian organization will then turn around and have partners in other countries that they will fund. Um, there's some exceptions, but they're usually like very big kind of UN or US organizations that have offer a very unique, offering that that there's no comparable Canadian organization. There are funds in Canada, like things like the Equality Fund, for example, is one that I point to, that the Equality Fund's mandate and mission is to fund local organizations in countries around the world. So, there are exceptions, but that's not a government organization. It's just one that receives government funding.
Thanks, Jesse. Alejandra is asking, speaking about AI terms, how is this point being managed? Is it accepted or not? How dangerous is it to use it? Could it be used as a support? How much is it advisable to use it? I guess, what's your advice on AI?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I think one that's going to come up more and more, right? I mean, I mean, this is really just my personal opinion. I don't have like, an official government line on this at all. Um, I think if you use it kind of, carefully and thoughtfully, it can be a really great tool. I think definitely if you, you know, if you kind of can give it the right kinds of guidance and questions and parameters, sometimes it can really help you create, even do some of the grant writing. But I would have a huge caveat that you want to go back yourself and double check everything, and make sure that it's actually ticking all the boxes. Because I don't think, unless you've been spending a lot of time developing your own kind of government grant writing chatbot yourself, there's still a lot of potential errors I think that can come into it as well. So maybe it's a great way to sort of brainstorm and create a framework, but I think I would also really encourage you to really review really carefully.
That's great. Thanks, Jesse. Lori is asking suggestions for our charity where no government funding is available, federal, provincial, or municipal. They've checked government websites, signed up for MP, MPP, and municipal newsletters. They also email their MPP and MP office to remind them of their programs, and to know if there's any grants suitable for them.
I mean, it sounds like they're doing a lot of the right things, Lori. It sounds like you guys have got a lot of bases covered. I think that, I mean, that in that case, you also might want to look at if there's other organizations in your community that are getting funding, they're doing similar work. Can they offer you any advice or guidance, or are they willing to collaborate with you? That would be one area. I definitely encourage you to go to local MPs and MPPs like you're already doing. That can be a good starting point. I think the other thing I'd recommend, and maybe you're doing this too, but it's again organizations like Imagine Canada or other sector-wide organizations within individual provinces or municipalities. Um, that can be another place to kind of look. They have better luck at getting the government's attention than one individual organization. So they can be a great place to go and say, look, like we're really struggling. You guys have done this on behalf of the sector. Do you have any tips or advice you can give us, or make any introductions for us?
Excellent. Thank you. Um, Ben is asking, can you discuss the difference in strategy? Whoops, the difference in strategy between applying for funds and grants from a new project or program and an existing one. In Ben's experience, government funding sources seem to prefer new projects that have been designed specifically for the funding opportunity, when the charity is simply trying to raise funds to continue or expand existing programs and services.
Oh yeah, I hear you. I hear you, Ben. I've been in that situation myself many times. And I think it's there's a bit of a so yes, first of all, you're right. Government has that tendency, and I think like many funders, they want to feel like you're creating some kind of bright, new, shiny project just for them. And that can be really frustrating when you already have a program that works and is running well and just needs additional funding. Um, in my experience, there can be a bit of an art and a science to thinking about, well, are there, smaller aspects of the program that you could maybe add on, or ways that you can position that existing program a little bit differently, so that it actually meets the requirements of government, but you're also still able to fund some of the really good ongoing work that you're doing. And I'm not saying, I am saying be creative, but I'm not saying be dishonest in any way. But I'm more saying like, what if you're already doing something, and if you were just to add on, an extra activity, or in terms of change, think a little bit about, maybe there's not enough focus on inclusion, or you want to add in some additional piece around gender equality, for example. Maybe you can do that to an existing program and make it really attractive to government funder without having to sort of start from scratch and develop something new.
That's such valuable advice, Jesse. Thank you. Deepa is asking if you have any tips on accessing provincial funding as a national organization. They see a lot of other national charities get support from provincial or even municipal governments, but they have had really struggled to secure this in the past as a national charity.
So that's such a good question. And I've been in that situation myself, working for national organizations and being charged with securing provincial funding. And it can be definitely challenging. What I would suggest is, as much as you can, um, you want to lean on local, if you have local partners or anyone from your organization who's active in that community. You want to get a good understanding of kind of local relationships and local priorities in a given province. And then have someone, ideally, I mean, this is maybe goes back a bit more to pre-COVID days, but ideally have someone travel there, and show that you really mean it. You really believe in this work in this province enough that you're actually sending someone to go and have a meeting, and that you have local relationships and local partners, who are supporting you as well. Because sometimes it can be a bit of an issue where it's like, well, if what do they really have the credibility, with locally in the community, and also, if we could choose between someone based in our province and someone based somewhere else, why wouldn't we choose someone based in our province? I think what you need to show them is that there's, if they give money to you in their province, they're going to get, media attention and support from constituents in return, because you actually are doing it, having an impact on their community.
That's great advice. Thank you. Eldon has asked, what's the average turnaround time for most grants? Um, any
Sorry,
guesstimation?
I'm sorry. I mean, uh, okay, that's a great question, but I can't give you a rule of thumb. Um, I have seen, like, I, some departments, some selected departments are trying to be more transparent about how long it's going to take them to get back to you. So there are some efforts underway. Not all departments are doing that though, and it can definitely be a bit of a black box sometimes. You just put in your application. The reason I'm laughing is because, in my experience, I think it can be anything from 6 months, and up would be a reasonable guess. But it can be up a lot, further. Um, I think one thing to keep in mind, and is that, what is it? So there's, and I can't go into this right now because we don't really have time, but there's a federal funding cycle. They have a fiscal year. There's certain times of year when they're going to be allocated, they need to make funding decisions, and certain times of year when they need to be spending money in order to make sure that they've spent out their budget for the year. So if it's good to have that kind of thing in mind, because that's sometimes what motivates them. You might all of a sudden find out, oh, they actually need to get money out the door before the end of March. So all of a sudden you're going to get a call from them in February saying they're ready to move forward. But I mean, I can't give you a rule of thumb on that. It's a tough one.
Kyle in the chat says, I identify deeply with that laugh. And I think all of us do, Kyle.
Yeah, I guess
All of
it's
us.
not magic, there's exactly, it can be one of the most frustrating things I think about government funding, is that once you've submitted, you've done all this work to submit something, and then you don't get any feedback for such a long time. Yeah, and I wish I could fix that, but I unfortunately cannot.
Um, Abanti, again, I apologize if I mispronounce your name. Sometimes the programming that they're applying for funding for a project for goes beyond, say, a 2-year cycle, or at least they would like to run it that way. If this is the case, would you advise applying for a grant for the total timeline, or splitting the project into effectively 2-year chunks and then reapplying every every couple of years or every year?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, that would be a good question to ask someone who's managing the funding, first of all, if that's possible, if you can get a hold of someone. But I think in that case, I would really just direct you to what is it that they're telling you in terms of the funding requirements, and how long are they willing to give you funding. Um, I think there's been some movement, I would say, um, I would say in the international, development sector through funding through Global Affairs Canada. Lately, they've been more willing to give like 5 years of funding or even more,
Mm.
but that's pretty exceptional. I think 2 is a much more standard from the federal government in terms of 1 or 2 years. Um, I think, which is frustrating, but I think probably I'm going to have to say that you're better off to, make sure you're meeting whatever parameters they've laid out, and then even if you're just going to be doing the same program again, you're going to have to go back and do it again, and do the application again, unfortunately.
Thank you so much, Jesse, for everything today, for your fantastic presentation, for answering our questions. I certainly learned so much. There were a couple of extra questions that we did not have time to get to. It looks like Jessie is inviting you to reach out via her LinkedIn or via email. So if we did not answer your question today, please feel free to reach out to her and connect. Thank you for joining us. Before we go, I do want to let everyone know that there is a very short survey that's going to pop up right after the session. It will only take you about 20 seconds to complete, but it helps us out so much to learn what about these sessions is useful and great for you. Our next session is called Getting Your Board Excited About Grants on December 5th. So a great follow-up to this session here. We're posting the link in the chat. Please sign up for that. Once again, Jessie, thank you so much for your time today. I know that we've learned a lot about government grants, so thank you. I hope everyone has a fantastic Wednesday, and we will catch you on December the 5th. Bye, everybody. Thank you for coming.